Well, a very good morning to you once again. Coming to you live from Cape Town on Budget Day. Today is the day where the Finance Minister sets out the agenda for how our finances are going to be spent this coming fiscal year. And it's a very big budget for him. And a big worry, actually, for the Finance Minister is to try and figure out how he's going to get more money. Where's he going to get that money from? Is he going to take more loans? Already, South Africa in not the greatest position when it comes to the amount of money that it owes. And can you burden the taxpayer more with increasing the taxes? Well, that's another question. What about rumours that are swirling around that we may see an increase in VAT? Now, that's one thing that I think South Africans are a little bit nervous about, is that there's been huge speculation that there may be an increase in VAT, and that moves obviously from the current level of 15%, and it could go up to either 16 or 17%. So that is a reality that we may be facing come later this afternoon when the Finance Minister unveils what he's going to say. So this is a lot of speculation, because I think he's holding his cards very close to his chest at this point. And anything we speak about now are merely predictions. Well, let me try and get some predictions, and perhaps maybe we'll get something right from my next guest that's joining us here outside of Parliament. It's Roy Havemann. He's the senior economist from the Bureau for Economic Research. Roy, good to have you. Thanks so much for dropping by this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the day.
So I was saying that the Finance Minister is keeping his cards very close to his chest on this one, and rightly so, because it's a tough one. I don't know how to balance. This is a balancing act that I'm not sure we've had to look at in a very long time.
Absolutely. So if you look at the headline numbers, the Treasury is probably going to announced they're going to bring in about 2 trillion in revenue. Spending, however, is about 2.3 trillion, and that leaves you a gap of 300 billion. And if you convert that into borrowings, that's R1 billion a day, which is essentially what we are planning on borrowing over the next year or two, and what we have been borrowing over the last 5 years. So if you just think about the implications of that on debt is just rising and going up and up, and already debt has crossed the 75% of GDP mark, and it's probably going to rise a bit further. So yes, it's a very difficult balancing act for the minister to balance.
Okay. Well, it certainly is, and besides all of that, it's not only the local affairs that he has to deal with, which I want us to focus on quite a bit. It's also what's happening on international relations, and we do know that this is a very trying time for South Africa, as we've become firmly in the sight of the US President Donald Trump. He's been making a lot of assertions and, pulling off funding and talking not too favorably of South Africa. Will this impact what we hear today at all?
Yes, absolutely. So if you just look at Donald Trump, for example, talking about increasing tariffs, there's a lot of talk, for example, that South Africa will be taken out of AGOA. Those will have economic implications, and the economic implications of those are reduced revenue, because we'll be getting less money from trade, we'll be getting less money from spending, and that will obviously just make the minister's job even more difficult.
Yeah. And what a big balancing act, and also the money that South Africa depend on. I mean, through the different programs that fund here, which that funding freezes in action. Again, we've got to find money to now try and help the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. So, as you know, highlighted, 17% of the HIV/AIDS program is funded by the US. So there has to be, how do we find that sort of money? And then how do you keep social grants rising at inflation? Because I think many people out there rely on social grants, and increasing social grants to a living wage is very difficult for the minister to find. And so a lot of people are dependent on this budget today.
The major question which you just asked, how do we find the money? Because South Africans are very strained at the moment, and we've got major unemployment issues. There's no job creation, and this is probably what the biggest problem is that without growth in the economy, we're not going to see the jobs being created. But the minister needs to find money somewhere. So his one option is to go out and loan money, which already we are in far too much debt, 74% of GDP, I think, or 75%, you'll correct me. And then, of course, is the big problem when it comes to the idea of tax or increasing VAT. Do you think this is something that we could face the reality of this afternoon?
Well, there have obviously been rumours over the weekend that the minister will increase VAT. Some people have said even up to 2 percentage points. We'll take VAT from 15% to 17%.
So let me pause there. How badly will that affect us? Because if you go from where we are now, 15 to let's say worst case scenario, 17%, This affects the poorest of the poor. This really does when we go for VAT. So, but how badly will our lives be affected with an increase in VAT?
Well, it affects all of us. I mean, every single thing you buy is obviously subject to VAT, so that'll increase the cost of everything. There are a number of exempted goods, so goods that don't attract VAT, but it's a very limited list, and those are aimed at the poor, but it's things like maize and those sorts of things. It's a very limited list, and so the poor are not really that protected from a VAT hike. And I think that just goes fundamentally to the point that what really needs to happen, like you said, is we need to get economic growth to rise so that we can get revenues up and we can get the system moving again, because we can't continue forever at these low levels of economic growth.
So, okay, that's VAT. Normal taxes, I mean, because that's something as well that people look at. Obviously, there's the sin taxes, which we can see 9 times out of 10, that's always going to be one of the avenues to get more. Another fuel levy. Let's talk about other avenues that the minister has to take from us, South Africans.
Yes, well, there has always been talk about a wealth tax.
Yes.
And that I don't think is necessarily a good idea. I'm very reluctant to do it. I mean, one of the big things you must remember about a wealth tax is exactly that. It takes away wealth from people, and that in a country with inequality, that's often seen as a good thing, and I can see that argument. But of course, what happens is then after a while, all that wealth has been taken away. It's a bit like killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Yeah. And so what you really should try and work out is how do you get the goose to lay more eggs, rather than trying to kill the goose. And you do that by raising economic growth. So I don't think that they'll go for a wealth tax. VAT will be politically very difficult to pull off because it affects many of the poor and many voters, and it previously was very contentious when VAT went from 14% to 15%. And so there might be a little bit of an increase in personal income tax. But that also affects economic growth because, you know, every single rand that goes to the state, if it's not used effectively, is a drag on economic growth. So there are very few options available today, actually.
Yeah, there really are. And the more we speak about it, the more the options are becoming less and less, and it's turning into a very difficult one. But when we talk about our taxes and what it's used for, this is now where we bring state-owned entities into the picture, because we'll have a look at universities, and at this moment that's one thing we are looking at, that the accommodation, the building of universities, the building and the upkeep of schools, hospitals, the police, the roads, the infrastructure, the electricity, the water, and the list is endless, and these are huge priorities. I mean, let's just talk water. We're in big problems when it comes to water.
Absolutely. So if you think about the whole water value chain, you need to spend money on bulk water. So that's typically the money that the water that comes, for example, from Lesotho into Johannesburg. And then you need to spend money at the municipal level, and we know that there have been major shortfalls of spending there. There's very little that the Minister of Finance can do. A lot of that actually has to be done by the municipalities themselves. But in the long run, water is our big risk, as everybody knows. I mean, we've obviously had a number of water shortages in Johannesburg, and that affects economic growth, and I think affects the ordinary South African out there in a very real way. Yeah. And it's something we really need to think about, how do we fix?
Yeah. In the biggest of ways. I mean, you've got communities that write to us on a daily basis saying they haven't had a drop of water for 3 years. And I mean, these are citizens of the country, and that is one right that everybody should have, is access to clean drinking water, which is not the case. Eskom. It's always a big problem when it comes to talking about electricity supply in the country. Where are we with the IPPs? Because that's one of the issues, but we certainly have seen a stabilization. However, I don't know about how much, and I don't know how much it's helping the economy per se. Perhaps you can let us into that.
Yeah, so one of the big things that has happened is obviously the end of load shedding, at least briefly. So we had a load shedding come back again at the end of January, but that I think shows that the Treasury and the government is moving in the right directions with IPPs, because they certainly added a lot of capacity to the grid. What we'll be looking for today is further guidance on how the Treasury is thinking about financing what's called independent transmission projects. So that's the grid that connects the IPPs to Johannesburg and to the main industrial centres, and they have been talking about a model very similar to IPPs, where basically you create an environment where you can allow people to build these transmission lines. So that I think will hopefully be a very positive thing coming out of the budget. The other big thing about Eskom is that they did announce in 2023 that a lot of Eskom's debt would be moving from Eskom to the National Treasury, to the state. And so we'll be looking for further details about how that's going to work today and the impact on the overall borrowing levels of the country today. So that's another big Eskom thing to look out for.
Transnet, people saying that there are tiny little green shoots of seeing some improvement with Transnet. Obviously, that's not filtering through as yet, but I mean, what are you analysing? What are you seeing there?
So we have seen port capacity improve a little bit over the last year or so, which has been great. There has been moves from Transnet to open up the ports. So, for example, if you look in China, many of how China works is they have these public-private partnerships where they use international port operators to operate the ports. That's where we're going with Transnet in South Africa. That said, Transnet still has a very big financial hole, and there's talk about anywhere between 40 billion and 50 billion, probably about 46 billion, that Transnet needs to have this year just to keep ticking over. So that's the one thing to look at in the budget today is these two things, the progress on Transnet reform, and the second thing is obviously how much money Transnet's going to get from the Treasury.
My final question to you as we sort of go to a break now is social grants, because whenever you speak to the person on the street and you speak to the viewer out there asking what they want, that's what they want. They want an increase in social grants, even though half of the population is dependent on them, and it's a very big burden. We help people, there's no two ways about it, but it's a big burden on the state and the pocket of the country. What do you foresee with social grants?
Yeah, so I mean, the Treasury will at least have to increase social grants by inflation, because I think many poor people are struggling, and as you say, many people have now become reliant on social grants, which is really not what we want. We want people to be in jobs, and so we're unlikely to see any extension or new grants, but almost certainly I think the social relief of distress grant, the old 350 grant, which is now I think 370, will probably be extended for another number of years. And there's also been court cases about it, so that creates another risk for the minister today.
Yeah. All right. We haven't even gotten to the public sector wage bill, but that's another conversation hopefully we'll pick up on in the next hour. Roy, thank you. Thanks very much for chatting to us this morning, taking a look at some of the expectations for budget 2025. And I think you've gathered that this is not going to be an easy one. Money doesn't grow on trees, believe it or not. And that's unfortunately what the minister has to figure out. Where does he find this money to find the balancing act? Let's take a break. See you after this.